Hi, this is Andy Braitman again. We're back at Braitman Studio. I'm going to talk a little bit about brushes and their uses and different brands. Cheap Joe's has this wonderful brush. It's called a Serendipity brush. They're made by Escoda, which is a really classy brush maker. I use those. I use a Richardson brush. I use a Monarch by, I think it's Winton makes this, or Winsor Newton. I'll use different knives and brushes for different tools, different effects. When I look at a brush, I look for a few things. I look for the way the bristles are broken. And you can see a good brush has narrower bristles that they start to pop out. And so they're actually tapering it like a good haircut. So you have this nice longer bristles in the center and shorter at the edges. That gives you tip control, and you still need, one of the differences between oil and acrylic is the strength of the bristle. So we use these white china bristles because they're strong enough to hold the weight of the paint that we need to use as oil painters, but they're thin enough and give you enough control so that they have the delicacy at the tip. And that's a unique quality of the oil brushes. The acrylic brushes are meant to be used wet. They're usually synthetic, and they're meant to hold up over a lot of wetness, a lot of dunking. And I tend to not get the bristles wet. I'll use a lot of the same size brush, or take the brush for different colors. They always mix up anyway. Or I'll take a paper towel and really work hard at pulling the paint and pigment out of the bristle so I can reuse that same brush again. And it's a workout to do that. And you can see that you can still keep that razor spatula tip as long as you put in the muscle to make that work. So first thing I'll do is I'll break a brush open and look at the quality of the bristles, see how tapered it is, how many loose bristles there are. These Richardson brushes are really cheap brushes, inexpensive and cheaply made. See all that hair that flies out? But when you get a good one, it's really worth it, because you can take this rough, like windblown hair, and get a nice spatula tip with it. And I'll show you how to do that in another segment. So I'll take these brushes and I'll investigate them first and see how many bristles there are, how evenly cut they are. And once I've gotten rid of the loose hair, that's a great way to work. The Serendipity is a higher quality, softer brush, whereas the Workhorse, it's called a Workhorse, seems to have a firmer bristle and can give me more bounce on the stroke, so I can really play with that. I tend to hold the brush differently than most people. I tend to lock it in with underneath the fat of that big muscle in your hand, and lock it in over with my little finger and balance it on the fulcrum on this finger. And that leaves my thumb and forefinger free to move the edge of the brush up and down that finger, depending on which edge of the brush I'm working on. And you'll notice that my filberts tend to narrow down rather than as I use them, because I work on the sides of the brushes. And you can see how long I've been working with a brush by how angled that is. So I have been working with this one longer than that, and you can see how angular that gets as I work it. So these are all filberts, and you can see they have different shapes and different length bristles. And this is a little flat, because you can tell that's got a flat end. And again, these are different sizes, and it's just a question of how long I use them, how much they wear down on the sides. And that happens, I'll show you exactly how I do that, because I tend to load the paint up on the side, so I have a lot of paint, and then I'll take the paint and I'll turn the brush slowly, so I'm almost having the back of the brush up against the canvas. And as long as I can keep turning the brush, I have fresh paint applied to the surface of the canvas. I run out of paint, now I'm just smearing it in. So I tend to keep it, the freshness of the paint comes from that little roll technique, and that roll technique to the brush is what the filbert allows me to do, and that's all on the side. That's why they're worn out here. Ideally, I can have a brush stroke, depending on how quickly I turn the brush. I can turn it over quickly, or I can turn it over very slowly and let that brush strokes extend over the length of the canvas. And it's all with the speed with which I turn my thumb across my finger there. Brushes.